I'd like to welcome out the front Dr. Michael Flood. Michael is an internationally recognised researcher on men, masculinities, violence and sexualities. He's made a significant contribution to scholarly and community understanding of men's and boys' involvements in building gender equality, and published on young men's use of pornography and young heterosexual men's sexualities, as well as on topics of violence prevention, fathering and anti-feminist men's groups. Dr. Flood is also a trainer, community educator and activist, and we're looking forward to hearing him speak on fostering boys and men's resistance to pornography. I'd like you to welcome Dr. Michael Flood.
Thank you for that, and look, it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. And in terms of my bio, I sort of realised that I think I was one of the first researchers in Australia to actually do anything about children's and young people's exposure to pornography. In a 2003 piece with Clive Hamilton for a think tank called the Australia Institute, and we documented the extent of children's and young people's exposure to both sort of X-rated videos and internet pornography. We made recommendations for what to do about that, and perhaps predictably created a kind of firestorm of media controversy. I think I did something like 40 interviews in a day in response to that media. And in response to that report, and there have now been two further bits of research in Australia by Fleming and by Green, but there's very little research done. There's been very little research in Australia, but Andrew mentioned, in fact, a growing global scholarship, and I was reviewing that scholarship in preparing for this symposium, and there is now, in fact, a massive body of scholarship, more than I can do justice to, although I'm going to try, mainly by speaking quickly and drinking coffee. But there is a massive body of scholarship now which demonstrates kind of incontrovertibly, sort of undeniably, that pornography consumption among young people has demonstrable impacts on their attitudes and their behaviour. And I'm going to run through some of that scholarship, and I'm going to talk about then what to do about it. I've put my email address up there, and in fact I have put the PowerPoint slides. I took the liberty of putting the slides from this presentation up on a website I run called XY Online, and so you can find those slides there, but I'm sure they'll also be available via Collective Shout. And I've also put Twitter up, so for those of you who are kind of social media savvy can tweet whatever you would like. So let's start with definitions. I use the term pornography, many academics use the term pornography to refer to sexually explicit media that are primarily intended to sexually arouse the audience. So in other words, pictures of nudity, female or male nudity or semi-nudity, implied sexual activity, actual sexual activity. And in materials that are designed or intended to arouse the audience. So a medical textbook doesn't count, the materials you were just shown a moment ago do count. And one thing to note about this definition is that this is a neutral definition. It doesn't assume that images of sex and sexual activity are necessarily a bad thing, although you'll hear that much of what is available as pornography is bad in all sorts of ways. But this definition, nevertheless, is neutral. It doesn't assume that images of bodies and sex are offensive or obscene or somehow harmful in some way. So, just to say a little bit about pornography. If we look at pornography and pornography consumption, it's very, very clear that most of the users of pornography, whether that's commercial or amateur or whatever the genre is, most users are heterosexual men. And in fact, looking at and masturbating to pornography is the routine practice of large numbers of men and small numbers of women in Australia. The adult industry likes to tell you it's a couples industry, but that's not true according to the research. And certainly if you look at the commercial pornography industry, much of it caters to heterosexual men. Now it's true that as a proportion, more gay men, as a proportion of all gay men, look at pornography than a proportion of all heterosexual men. But given that gay identified men are anywhere from sort of 2 to 8% of the population, the proportion of pornography consumed in Australia in general is by heterosexual men. And there are gender differences. Men are more likely than women. Males are more likely than females. This is true of young men and older men. More likely to use pornography, more likely to view pornography frequently, more likely to be aroused by the pornography they see, more likely to have favourable attitudes towards it. And there are further differences too. Boys and girls alike may look at pornography for curiosity or for information about bodies and sex, but boys and men are much more likely to use pornography for masturbation. They're more likely also to initiate its use. one common path to use among girls and women is being introduced to it by a male partner, or a male partner suggesting that they use pornography as part of their sexual lives. Whereas boys and men are more likely than girls and women to view pornography by themselves, to view it in same-sex groups, that is with other boys and men, and also more likely to consume a variety of types of pornography, of different types of pornography. So, putting it in technical terms, pornography is a cornerstone of the autoerotic, the kind of self-sexuality of males, of large numbers of males. So, there are also some significant shifts. I've already run through that. There are also some significant shifts if we look at young people's exposure. One is an increase in overall rates of exposure. Now, I have to be a little bit careful here. There's no hard Australian data to support the claim that more young people these days see pornography than they did in previous generations. There's certainly plenty of reason to think that's the case, but there's no hard data in Australia. There is, however, US data from longitudinal research, which tracks groups of young people over time, and it shows an increase in both deliberate and accidental exposure among young people. And there's every reason to think that the same is going on in Australia. Because of access, because of the increasing normalisation of pornography, the sense in which pornography is a normal part of young people's peer cultures and of our popular culture in general. And so it also means that it's likely that young people are seeing pornography at younger ages. The age of first exposure is dropping, and there's a little bit of Australian evidence on that. The means of exposure are shifting too. So with the internet and with internet-enabled mobile phones and other devices, that means that young people's pornography exposure is increasingly online rather than offline. It's less likely, less of a proportion of pornography these days is discovering your dad's magazines or your dad's DVDs, and more of it these days is sort of by oneself or with others via the internet. And so the means of exposure are shifting too. And another thing that's shifting too is that growing numbers of young people are producing pornography, taking photos of themselves or their partners, distributing those photos or sexually explicit materials either with their consent or without their consent, and so on. So there's pornography production also going on. Finally, there's shifts in pornography's content itself. Again, there's not hard data on this. And I keep saying this because I kind of want to hold myself as an academic and hold us to a high standard about what we claim about pornography. And there's certainly evidence that violence and aggression are routine in pornography. You saw that very briefly described just a moment ago, but it's harder to track changes over time, although there's some evidence of shifts in pornography's content. So I'm going to make some claims about effects, about pornography's effects. And to do so, I have to get a little bit technical. And there are several sorts of studies that are relevant in terms of pornography's effects. And it's worth understanding the differences between those. So experimental studies are something like, take a room full of university students. Let's assume that you're university students who've all signed up, you've given your consent to participate in a university study. I measure your attitudes or your behaviours, then show you 2 hours of pornography or 5 hours of pornography, and then measure your attitudes again, and come back 3 months later and measure your attitudes again. That's one type of study, an experimental study, where you do some kind of experiment and measure impact. Another type of study is correlational. In fact, this is the most common type of study when it comes to pornography's impact. Do we think that pornography shapes young men's and young women's attitudes towards sex and bodies? Well, let's survey young people. Do they look at pornography? What type of pornography do they look at? And what are their attitudes towards sex and attitudes towards women? And so we can show a correlation between those two, and I'll get to those in a moment, but we can't necessarily assume which way the causality goes, which one caused which. Longitudinal studies are a higher standard of proof. Longitudinal studies are the best type of studies we've got. Correlational studies are important. Longitudinal studies are better still because they follow a group of people over time. Let's say this is 1,000 adolescents, age 14 to 16. Let's say at age 14, we measure your exposure to pornography, your attitudes towards sex, your sexual behaviour. Then 2 years later, we come back and measure all that stuff again. And we look for associations over time. For example, those adolescents who started using pornography in that period, do your attitudes towards sex or your use of sexual violence, does that vary compared to the adolescents who didn't ever start using pornography in that period? So longitudinal studies are better still. So that is getting a bit technical, but I wanted to explain this because Sometimes some people who say, oh, pornography doesn't have effects, or the research that does show pornography have effects, they're dodgy methodological studies. I think it's worth knowing how to rebut those criticisms. And one of the criticisms is that experimental studies are artificial. If we show 2 hours of pornography to a bunch of male university students, it's a fake setting, it's a laboratory setting, it's not the same as those young men, at home masturbating to pornography themselves. Therefore, we can't really make claims about effects. And I think, yes, experimental studies are artificial, but in fact, as it says there, they may actually underestimate pornography's effects. And they do so for a couple of reasons. One is typically in those experimental studies, you only show pornography to the participants for a couple of hours, whereas most young men who regularly consume pornography are looking at it for 10 or 20 hours a week, so a much greater level of exposure. Second, in experimental studies, typically the participants don't masturbate, aren't allowed to masturbate. And of course, masturbation is a very common part of certainly many men's use of porn. And arguably, masturbation actually increases the impact of pornography use because it ties your kind of sense of sexual arousal and sort of sexual involvement to pornography use rather than just looking at it more dispassionately. So when someone says to you, oh, experimental studies are fake, you can say, yes, they may actually underestimate pornography's effects. Okay, so that's a little bit about the method, but let's actually look at the research. Before we look at impact, the other thing to acknowledge is that the impacts of exposure are not the same for everybody. And you've already heard this acknowledged briefly. That the impacts of exposure are mediated, are shaped by different kinds of factors. And one factor is the characteristics of the viewer themselves, who it is who's watching that pornography. So we know, for example, that children and young people of different ages will react in different ways to pornography. So, for example, a reaction of disgust is much more common among 8, 9, 10-year-olds than it is among 16, 17-year-olds. Whereas 16 and 17-year-olds will have other kinds of reactions, partly because they may already know something about sex, they may be sexually active and so on. So age makes a difference, gender makes a difference, sexual experience makes a difference, parental involvement makes a difference. What kinds of conversations have they already had about pornography prior to exposure? Second, what sense the viewer makes of the material also makes a difference. And so, for example, you can show the same 2-minute clip of a particular scene in pornography to two viewers, and one may see it as kind of violent and degrading and horrible, and the other may see it as interesting and sexy and arousing and so on. And the different sense they make of that scene will impact on its impact on them. And so we know that pornography has a greater impact on the viewer when they're more active and involved, when they're really paying attention, when they think it's realistic, when they're watching it with a view to arousing themselves, to masturbation rather than in some other way, and so on. But we don't actually know much about it. We don't know much about young people's experiences of watching pornography and what that means, how that works. And then there's the kind of character and the context of exposure. Of course, the content matters, and I'll come back to this in a moment. The duration of viewing. Are they watching it for 5 minutes on the school bus? Or are they spending 3 hours flicking through pornography sites late at night on their computer? Are they watching it by themselves while masturbating? Are they watching it with a partner while engaged in sex or talking about sex? Or are they watching it with a bunch of mates with pizza, where it's more humorous and playful? And it's not to say that any of those different forms of viewing are necessarily less or more harmful. I'm just making the point that the context of viewing matters. Okay, so let's get on to some impacts, some actual concrete impacts. And I'm going to talk about 5 or 6 different forms of impact. The first one is pornography as sex education. It's very, very clear that pornography shapes young people's knowledge and attitudes. And it shouldn't surprise you to know that comparing young people who've looked at pornography and young people who haven't, the young people who've looked at pornography know more about sex. They know more about bodies and genitals and the kinds of things that 2 or 3 or 4 people can do with their genitals. Now, you may think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just going to stop bumping that. You may think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but undeniably, pornography shapes sexual knowledge. And in fact, pornography is arguably these days a key sex educator for young people. It's a key source, particularly for boys and men's understandings of sex, bodies, and so on. And there's good research showing links between pornography exposure and more liberalised sexual attitudes from correlational studies and from longitudinal studies following people over time. So comparing young people who've looked at pornography and young people who haven't, exposure to pornography is associated with acceptance of premarital, extramarital, non-marital sexual relations. It's associated with more positive attitudes towards casual sex, towards recreational sex, and to other kinds of sexual practices. And it's associated with acceptance of pornography itself. Again, this isn't particularly surprising. And there's been some new research since the review I wrote in 2010, including longitudinal research, showing, for example, that among boys and girls in a Dutch study, those who'd looked at pornography were more likely to have recreational attitudes towards sex a year later than those who hadn't looked at pornography, and so on. And that's controlling for any differences at the start, controlling for differences at baseline. So it's a more solid kind of evidence. So that's one dimension of pornography's effects, pornography as sex education. A second dimension of sex education is not about their attitudes, but about what they actually do. We know that pornography shapes how young people and adults, we're focused in this symposium on children and young people, but we shouldn't sit here smugly going, oh, it's those children and young people. Us adults are fine. This stuff doesn't affect us. It does very clearly. And in fact, I just read a study last night that showed that the levels of impact, for example, for sexual aggression, which I'll get into in a moment, are similar for adolescents and for adults. So some people think the impact is likely to be greater among adolescents. Certainly for one issue, sexual aggression, there's no evidence that it is. So this is my point about the second dimension of pornography's impact. Pornography shapes what young people do, what young people want to do sexually, and what they actually do sexually. And there's several forms of evidence of that. One form of evidence is young people themselves report that. Although many young people, like many adults, also say, oh, it didn't shape my behaviour, but it shapes my friend's behaviour. It's called the third person effect, and it's well documented. We don't think it affects you, but you definitely think it affects people around you. Second, there's a whole lot of correlational research, finding that the young people who use pornography are more likely than other young people to also, for example, have practiced anal intercourse, are more likely to have had sex with more than one person at once, are more likely to have engaged in a variety of different sexual behaviours. And so there's now a sort of massive correlational evidence, more than I could possibly summarise, in fact, showing correlations between pornography use and increased sexual desire, greater numbers of partners, greater number of casual partners, higher frequency of masturbation, having had anal intercourse, younger age of first intercourse, and so on. And there's also research now among men who have sex with men, gay-identified men or homosexually active men, showing links between pornography consumption and having had unprotected anal intercourse, and so on. So again, a series of associations. And in fact, in Scandinavian countries, there are no fewer than 5 studies documenting links between using pornography and being interested in anal sex and having anal sex. And we're largely talking about young men being interested in anal sex and persuading or pressuring, often, girls and young women into having anal sex, and that being shaped by pornography. And in case you don't know, anal sex is very much a staple. It's a routine depiction in heterosexual pornography. And my issue here is not with anal sex per se. I have no problem with people having consenting anal sex. My problem is with the ways in which pornography's kind of sort of fetishizing of anal sex is shaping boys and men's pressuring or coercing of girls and young women into anal sex. And we don't know whether pornography is shaping boys and men's and maybe girls and women's interest in some other practices that are very common in pornography too. Practices such as ejaculating on your partner's face or body. Practices such as double or triple penetration. Practices such as multiple partner sex and so on. And there's some evidence that the relationships between these things are complex. That, for example, boys and men who are more sexually adventurous, who are more, I want to try stuff, I want to do different things sexually, even before looking at pornography, are more likely then to get into pornography and to try those things than other young men. But there's a circular relationship between these things. Certainly good evidence that pornography shapes unsafe sex. The vast majority of heterosexual pornography shows sex without condoms, and there's evidence that that shapes practice of unsafe sex, again among young people and among adults alike. Okay, so a whole lot of links, in other words, between pornography and young people's actual sexual behaviour. So not just young people's attitudes, but young people's actual sexual behaviour. Okay, And I've mentioned same-sex sexualities down the bottom there. There's some evidence too that some same-sex attracted and gay and lesbian young people turn to pornography to find evidence about how to have sex with other men or how to have sex with other women, in the absence of any discussion of homosexuality at school or elsewhere. And so some young people find gay or lesbian pornography to be one of the few places where their own sexualities as gay or lesbian sexualities are affirmed. Having said that though, that doesn't mean those forms of pornography are a good thing, because those forms of pornography also are vulnerable to the same critique, the same criticism around coercion, violence, and so on. Okay, so that's two levels of effect around sex education, and I'm going to come back to that. A third one is about betrayal. Some couples, see pornography as a healthy part of their relationship. That, pornography helps spice up their sex life, that kind of thing. And it seems to me, for that to be true, the pornography use would have to be open, it would have to be mutual, it would have to be freely chosen, and so on. And I don't think pornography use among most heterosexual couples meets those conditions. In fact, I think the vast majority of heterosexual men use pornography without their partners knowing. They do so in secret, or with their partner turning a blind eye to their pornography use. I'd love to know what the proportions are, but we just don't have that data. And in fact, we do know from the research that when female partners, wives or girlfriends, are aware of their male partner's pornography use, a substantial proportion of those women feel deeply distressed about it. It's not a majority, according to the couple of studies there are. So there's a significant British study by Bridges, and she found that among the women who knew that their male partners were regular porn users, about a third were kind of neutral, don't mind, I suppose it's okay. About a third were deeply distressed by it in various kinds of ways. They saw it they felt like it was an affair. They felt like it had a negative impact on their sexual lives and satisfaction. They felt less attractive and desirable to their male partners because of their male partner's porn use. And so, there's a real issue here of the ways in which male partners' secret porn use or public porn use is actually damaging for their relationships. And I know that other speakers today will come back to that in greater detail. And it's also clear that some men in relationships use pornography in ways which are coercive or abusive. They force or pressure their female partners into viewing pornography together, or indeed they make pornography out of their sex lives in ways that are coercive or ways that are even non-consenting, and so on. And then there's issues like revenge porn, where men and sometimes women put up sexually explicit images online as a form of revenge against former partners, and so on. Another issue here is addiction. And this is, I think, I've lost count now, but I think it's the fifth form of impact about which we should be concerned. And there's an emerging scholarship on addiction, on sex addiction, on cyber-sex addiction, on pornography addiction. And it suggests that some people use pornography in ways which are obsessive, which are compulsive, and which do harm to their family lives, to their working lives, and so on. And I'm a bit nervous about using the term addiction. It depends how we understand that term. But if we understand it in terms of one taste and you're hooked, one instance of pornography consumption and you're sliding down into an inevitable spiral of destruction and betrayal, that's not the case. It's clear that some people are regular pornography consumers without it becoming compulsive or addictive in that sense. It doesn't mean it might not be doing other forms of harm, but a kind of simplistic model of addiction is not useful here. At the same time, it is very, very clear that some people's use of pornography, particularly some men's and perhaps some women's, is habitual and compulsive and has negative impacts on their lives, resulting in financial difficulties, job loss, loss of partners, and so on. Now, the two areas of pornography's impact that I'm particularly concerned about are the next two. And the first of these is about pornography as sexist education. And I pulled out here some images which are routine in pornography. And in fact, the depiction of women in hurtful and callous and hostile ways is, I'm really depressed to say, absolutely routine in pornography. Kind of various forms of verbal and physical aggression against women are absolutely routine in heterosexual pornography. And it's very, very clear that pornography is an effective sexist educator. Pornography shapes boys and men's and girls and women's attitudes towards more sexist attitudes, towards more sexually objectifying attitudes, where girls and women are seen as sex objects and of value only because of their sexual status. And we know this from a whole bunch of different kinds of evidence. We know this first from research on mainstream media, on the impact, for example, of sexualised music videos and sexualised music. So we know this in the first instance from research outside pornography, research on other forms of mainstream media which sexualise women. We also know this from research on pornography itself, research both among adults and among young people. So people who use pornography on a regular basis are more likely to see women as sexual objects than people who don't. And this is true from experimental studies and from correlational studies and from longitudinal studies. And so it's very clear that pornography shapes sexist and sexually objectifying attitudes, and that then makes a difference to actual behaviour. There's some really fascinating studies, for example, that in quite sneaky ways test people on their behaviour. So for example, again, I might show you, let's assume you're a bunch of university students, show you some pornography which treats women in sexualised and objectifying ways, and measure your attitudes before and after doing that, but also do an experiment that you're not aware of until afterwards, where when you're walking to the next classroom for the second part of the experiment, someone engages you in conversation about a woman who's walking past. And the person who's engaging you in conversation is actually part of the experiment, unbeknownst to you, and they want to know, do you talk in a sexualised way about the woman who walks past? Or are you more prepared to sexually harass that woman than you might otherwise be? So in other words, look at behaviour. And these experiments do find that men exposed to sexualised content in pornography are more likely to harass and objectify women walking past than other men. So these things play themselves out in behaviour. Now, the most troubling impact of all is what I call, bluntly, rape training. And this is about the associations between pornography and sexual aggression. And there's consistent evidence, really consistent evidence. I mean, anyone who says, oh no, the jury's out, there's lots of debate, well, they simply haven't done their homework. They're either dishonest or ignorant, because there's such consistent evidence now of an association between pornography use, particularly violent pornography, and also non-violent pornography, and sexual aggression. So experimental studies show that following exposure to pornography, adults are more likely to support sexual aggression, to think that some women ask to be raped, to think that sexual violence is legitimate in some circumstances, to agree with rape myths and such. So we know, first of all, that pornography shapes attitudes towards sexual violence. And in fact, there's so much research now that people have done meta-analyses. And a meta-analysis is a statistical way of bringing together a number of different studies and looking at the findings of those studies across that research. And those meta-analyses show a consistent relationship between pornography use and attitudes towards sexual violence. That's true from experimental studies. It's also true from correlational studies of the attitudes of people out in the world. And so not only is there a link between pornography and sexually aggressive attitudes, there's a link between pornography and sexually aggressive behaviour. And I've listed on the slide there the fact that there's new evidence. There's so much evidence coming out now, including, for example, 2 longitudinal studies. And I'll give a little bit of detail over one of those longitudinal studies. This is one of the best pieces of research that we've seen. It was among US young people, 10 to 15. What are those plosives? US young people, 10 to 15, and they were followed over 3 years. And the young people who intentionally consumed X-rated violent materials, so pornography that showed violence, were over 6 times as likely as other young people to engage in sexually aggressive behaviour. So having looked at violent pornography, they were 6 times as likely as other young people followed in that research to engage in actual sexual aggression. And the researchers then controlled for factors that were there at the start of the study. For example, what were their existing attitudes towards violence? What were their attitudes towards sex at the start of the research? And controlling for those, they were still twice as likely, if they had looked at pornography, to commit sexual aggression, to actually force or pressure someone else into sex than other young people. So that is really persuasive evidence from that longitudinal study. And there's other longitudinal studies as well. And then finally, there was a meta-analysis, again, which just came out in 2015, a meta-analysis of 22 studies from 7 countries involving over 20,000 participants. And across those 22 studies, again, there was consistent evidence that pornography use is associated with actual sexual aggression, with actually committing sexual aggression. And there's some complexities here. One is there is a circular relationship between pornography and sexual aggression. Men who are more attracted to sexual aggression, who already have rape-supportive attitudes, who are already behaving in sexually aggressive ways, are more likely to use violent pornography, to be interested in violent pornography than other men. And when they do use violent pornography, it has a greater impact on them than among other men. So you take two groups of men, non-violent men who think violence against women is terrible, who don't agree with rape myths and so on, and men who agree with rape myths, who are sympathetic to violence against women, and expose them both to the same pornography, and the same violent pornography will have a greater impact on the high-risk men. Okay, I hope that makes sense to you. So there are kind of complex relationships here. I want to end this section on effects by talking about the need to go beyond some simplistic accounts. It's tempting sometimes to offer really simplistic stories about pornography's effects, and I want to avoid that. We need to go beyond kind of simplistic accounts in which pornography is like a needle stuck in your head, and then in a kind of robotic way you play out its messages in your own behaviours with your partners, your own attitudes. That's not the case. And what's clear when it comes to sexual violence, and my research these days focuses on violence against women, sexual violence, physical violence. And it's clear that pornography is a significant risk factor for that. We need to address pornography as part of preventing and reducing domestic and family violence and sexual violence. But it's not the only risk factor. We can't pretend it's the only or even the most powerful necessarily influence on the perpetration of violence. And in fact, there's a growing visibility of what are called integrative models that link pornography and other risk factors for sexual violence. So for example, you get higher rates of sexual violence among men who use violent pornography, but who also have hostile and distrustful attitudes towards women, who think that women are lying bitches, who think that women deserve what they ask for, who think that a woman in a short skirt is asking to be raped, and so on. So men who have hostile and distrustful attitudes towards women, men who are callous and unemotional, and who use violent pornography, they show higher risks for using sexual violence than men who show only some of those risk factors. So you get a kind of confluence of different kinds of models. So in other words, pornography increases the risks of sexual violence perpetration, doing sexual violence, for some individuals, some men and some women, much more than others. Some other things matter. The user matters. We need to know much more about how users interpret pornography. And we need to know much more about what people actually do while they're looking at pornography. And very little research has actually looked at the impact of whether you masturbated or not, whether you were looking at pornography with a partner or not, and what impact that has. It's very clear that content matters too. It's tempting to talk about pornography in general, but it's clear that pornography that shows aggression, that shows verbal aggression or physical aggression, is more harmful than pornography that shows no aggression at all. However, that meta-analysis I just talked about that showed associations between pornography and sexual aggression, it in fact found that the level of association between violent pornography and sexual aggression was pretty similar actually, not much higher than the level of association between pornography in general and sexual aggression. And that's probably because most pornography is violent, actually. And so, comparing violent pornography and sexual aggression and comparing pornography and sexual aggression, you're pretty much comparing the same things. And then there's a question here, what about pornography that doesn't show verbal or physical aggression, doesn't show a man choking a woman or pulling her hair or roughly engaging in oral sex with her, but shows other forms of degradation or shows women in other problematic ways? Does that have an impact? And again, there's some evidence it does. Finally, there's evidence that the form matters. There's some evidence that looking at video pornography is a more powerful experience and has a greater impact than looking at still images. Looking at a magazine or looking at still images online has less impact, according to some research, than looking at moving videos. Even if we look at just violent pornography, there's some evidence that online violent pornography has a greater impact than offline violent pornography. And it may be that the violent pornography offline is more extreme or more violent. We don't know, but there's some interesting kind of questions here. Okay, that's all I want to say about effects, and that's probably far more than you can possibly digest, but thank goodness you can find the slides. So, what to do about it? My watch died last week, and I sent it off to the US to get repaired, which is painful, so I don't know how I'm going for time. How long have I got left?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, that's perfect. So, I want to talk now about 50 ways to leave your lover. In fact, about 6 or 7 ways to leave your lover. For those of you who are old enough to remember, I'm making reference to a Simon and Garfunkel song. But I am now wanting to think about what can we do about this. And in the past, I have been an advocate for ISP-based filtering and other legal and technological strategies. I want to leave those aside for the moment and talk instead about social and educational strategies. And when it comes to social and educational strategies, abstinence is one of the popular ones. And I want to talk about 3 forms of abstinence. The first one is what I've loosely called Christian abstinence. And if one goes online or one goes to church or one looks at some of the resources that are available, you can see that there is a kind of one form of abstinence that's encouraged is an explicitly Christian kind of abstinence, a kind of faith-based response to pornography that says that, pornography is clearly harmful to families, harmful for our morals, for our values, and this Christian response also takes up feminist concerns with the ways in which pornography is harmful for women and degrading or hostile for women. And it advocates abstinence. It advocates quitting pornography and renewing one's vows to one's wife and to one's God and renewing one's faith and so on. Now, there's very little research on the effectiveness of this strategy. In fact, there's very little research on the effectiveness of any of the strategies I'm going to talk about. But one obvious constraint I can see is that it may have appeal particularly to Christian adherents rather than to more secular or non-Christian individuals who are struggling with the use of pornography. And of course, like other forms of abstinence I'm going to talk about, it's up against a very powerful sexual culture. So there's also, in fact, increasingly visible a much more secular kind of encouragement towards abstinence. And last year I was sort of wandering the internet, as one does, looking for materials related to kind of quitting pornography and addressing pornography. And there are huge online communities advocating quitting pornography. I'll just flick forward to this. There's a community online called NoFap, and FAP is a colloquial term in the US for masturbation. And NoFap is a kind of substantial online community on Reddit, which is a kind of internet forum, which is all about quitting masturbation and pornography. And some people argue for quitting pornography but not masturbation. Other people argue for quitting PMO altogether, pornography, masturbation, orgasm. And these men, typically it is men, call themselves fatstronauts or like astronauts. And they kind of sign up to make a commitment to quit their use of porn. And I mean, some of you may laugh, but I actually think this is really powerful. It's kind of a powerful, big self-help community where people try to encourage each other to change their relationships to pornography, to quit pornography, whether permanently for a certain period of time and so on. And it's motivated by various kinds of things. For some people on there, it is motivated by Christian belief. But in general, it's not defined by Christian belief. For some of the people on there, it's about stopping what's a compulsive habit. For other people, it's about taking control of their sexuality. For some people, it's about improving their relationships. For some people, it is about getting laid. It is a kind of, I want to have more sex, I want to get hot chicks, pornography's getting in the way. So there are differing motivations, some of which you might be troubled by or not. Most of the people there are heterosexual men. Most are young. Most are in their teens or 20s. And so I think it's really interesting as a kind of self-help community that's trying to change men's and women's relationship to pornography. And it's very supportive. It's kind of, you go, well done, that kind of thing. Its limits, though, are do I say this? No. It's highly individual. It's focused on individual solutions rather than changing the industry. It's focused on personal growth, and I'm all for personal growth, but it's not also addressing activism and social change. It's not very feminist. It doesn't address the harms that women in particular experience in pornography. It's more about the ways in which pornography limits men's sexuality, and undoubtedly it does do that. And some of the NoFap stuff actually slides into the kind of pickup artist community. And pickup artists, if you know anything about, is a pretty hostile and women-hating kind of scene. Okay, so that's 2 forms of abstinence. Third form of abstinence is feminist abstinence. And so you've got men like Robert Jensen, who's a US professor. He wrote a book called Getting Off, which got a lot of press when it's out. It offers a very kind of clearly feminist analysis of pornography, argues that the reason that men in particular should give up pornography is first, it's ethical. Pornography is about exploitation. It's about subordination. Men should stop using pornography because it's the right thing to do. It's our ethical obligation. Second, we should stop using pornography out of self-interest. Pornography constrains men and dehumanises men. It teaches us narrow ideas about sex and sexuality. It limits our ability to make meaningful connections with women. It kind of fosters a kind of emotional numbness and so on. I think it's a very powerful argument, actually. And his book is one of the most well-developed kind of feminist interventions into pornography, but it's actually remarkably underdeveloped. If you look at the no-fap community, they have these big, long lists, and so do the Christian books and other books on quitting pornography are kind of saying, here are the ways, day by day, step by step, to give up pornography. Jensen doesn't do that. He doesn't give us much guidance about how to actually change pornography use. And so it's limiting in some ways. And it, like some... another limitation of this appeal is it doesn't actually talk about what appeal, what draws men to pornography, what engages men, or what kind of inspires men to use pornography. What are the kind of emotional appeals, which those other things do too. Okay. Second broad strategy, so abstinence, 3 forms of abstinence. Second broad strategy is sexuality education. And I hope there is agreement in the room. I'm actually not sure there is, but I hope there's agreement in the room that children and young people deserve information and education on sexuality. That children and young people should have comprehensive sexuality education. And that's one way to limit the harms of pornography exposure. If we can give young people alternative forms of information about bodies, about sex, and so on. It won't do everything though, because some young people turn to pornography because they want something to masturbate to. They want pictures of sex and so on. And they want sexually explicit materials for information, for stimulation, and so on. So again, we've got a dilemma. But sexuality education is a key part of what we should be doing. And I believe that other speakers later today are going to do more about that. A third key strategy is pornography education. And here there is actually some evidence. There's some evidence that if you take adults, for example, through an education program, alerting them to the harms of pornography, if you inoculate them, in other words, it's like a vaccine. If you inoculate them against some of the sexist and violent supportive messages in pornography, and then you show them some violent pornography, the impact on them is less than among people who weren't inoculated, who weren't vaccinated, if you like, against its sexist impacts. And that lends support to a kind of media literacy strategy, that we should be talking to young people in schools, in sexuality education classes or media literacy classes about pornography. We should be doing pornography education. And Marie Crabb will be speaking later this morning about just that. And I think it is really fantastic work that Marie and her colleagues are doing in relation to pornography education through Reality and Risk. Reality and Risk, a project which includes educational resources in schools and for parents and so on, which includes engagement in public debate. If you haven't, see the documentary, which is part of its work, a really gripping and disturbing documentary, and I believe we'll see a little bit of that, or we hope to see a little bit of that today. And also Reality and Risk involves advocacy and training. It's very powerful, useful work, and it's research-based. It's based on research, so I really want to offer my support for it. A fourth strategy, fifth, again I've lost count, is probably the most controversial one I'll offer, ethical pornography. So sometimes, giving talks to parents about pornography and the harms of pornography, they come up afterwards and say, what type of pornography should my 16-year-old look at? Can you give me a list of websites that are better for my 17-year-old boy to look at? And I think that's a really interesting question. And while I don't think that minors should be looking at pornography, and I have some misgivings about adults' use of pornography too, I actually think that that it's worth a conversation about what good pornography looks like. And it's not hard, I think, to point to the ways in which at least some pornography is less bad, at least, than others. And we might argue, for example, that more ethical pornography obviously has been produced ethically. It doesn't involve children. By definition, that's criminal, that's abuse. Involves performers who weren't harmed in its use. But more than that, beyond occupational health and safety, we'd argue, I think, that ethical pornography doesn't show violence, doesn't show verbal or physical aggression, doesn't show people being choked or spanked or called sluts and bitches and so on. That's not okay. We might argue that ethical pornography also involves ethical forms of use. It's not used dishonestly, it's not used in coercive ways, and so on. Anyway, I won't say more about that, but I think that's a conversation worth having, including in relation to young people. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to run through this, but I do a lot of work on engaging boys and men in playing a positive role in ending violence against women. And what's very, very clear here is that we have to meet boys and men where they are, and girls and women where they are too. We have to start with the fact that lots of girls and women and boys and men look at pornography or are exposed to pornography. We have to avoid kind of shaming boys and girls for an interest in sex or a curiosity about sex. We have to explore some of the harms of that use and the benefits of that use. And there are some real dilemmas here. We have to find effective ways to engage boys and men and girls and women in thinking critically about pornography. And Marie Crabb and her colleagues have done some really powerful work on some of the educational hooks, the ways we can start to get those conversations going among boys and men. So, for example, appealing to the ways in which pornography is sexist, because lots of boys and men and girls and women don't want to be sexist. They think sexism is dead and buried. We've got gender equality. And the idea that, you want to put women down or see women as second-class citizens, that's discouraging. Equally, we might hold out to boys and men the carrot, the appeal of having good relationships with girls and women, or indeed having hot sex with girls and women, because I'm reliably informed that some young men are interested in having hot sex with girls and women. And so appealing to the ways in which pornography makes them bad lovers, will make them bad in bed, and bad as partners may be significant too. And there's other hooks that Marie Crabb and her colleagues talk about. There are some real dilemmas here. One is about sexual explicitness and talking about this at all. I think we have to get good at talking about sex and bodies and so on in ways that are clear and accurate and not coy and equally not baiting. We have to address the very clear sexual harms of pornography, but we have to do so in ways that aren't sex negative, that aren't erotophobic, that don't assume that sex is presumed guilty until found innocent. That's of no use to anyone. And it constrains our and children's sexual lives. We have to support sexual diversity. We have to be really affirming, I think, of the fact of diverse sexualities among children and young people. And the first one there I've skipped, but that's an important one too. We have to recognise children's and young people's sexual agency. They're not passive puppets. They make choices, they have desires, and so on. So we have to build a gender-just culture and a sexually ethical culture. That's the broader task. And so I see this work of addressing pornography and addressing the very clear harms associated with pornography as part of a broader effort to build a just, a pleasurable and ethical sexual culture for children, young people and adults alike, to foster egalitarian communities and equitable cultures among men and women alike. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for setting the stage for us today, with helping us see that indeed there are issues that we will be hearing about today, and for the work that you're doing as well in all of compiling all of that research.